name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the University of Denver, and I'm talking with Mona El-Ghobashy, independent scholar who's a participant in our second annual conference entitled What Went Wrong? Egypt's Failed Democratic Transition. Well, Mona, thank you for joining us today. I want to first ask you a question that is a reflection of what we often hear from the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department, John Kerry, and the spokesperson at the regular briefings keeps referring to Egypt as a society after the 2013 coup that's still pursuing a democratic transition. There seems to be an optimism that the State Department has with respect to the future of Egypt, specifically with respect to the prospects for democracy. Do you share that optimism?
I don't think most scholars who understand what a democratic transition is would share that optimism, nor would most ordinary citizens who actually are living under the regime in Egypt. The reason being is that instead of a democratic transition or any kind of progress towards participatory politics, which is the crux of what a democracy is, Egypt is experiencing the exact opposite. In fact, ever since the July 3rd, 2013 coup, Egypt has been experiencing a clampdown on the sort of participatory politics that we had become so used to post-revolution. In fact, that was the extraordinary breakthrough of the 2011 revolution, was that for the first time ever, ordinary Egyptians, and not just politicized activists and not just political party activists, but ordinary Egyptians felt that they had a stake in claim making, and they went out, some of them for the first time, but some of them repeated times, to make claims from big things like presidential elections to small local demands for rights-based things such as clean water, basic things like roads and schools and so on. Just using that very procedural notion of what a democratic transition is, I don't think it's analytically nor experientially borne out by the facts that Egypt is experiencing a democratic transition. Instead, what Egypt is experiencing is a massive state-sanctioned narrowing of the political arena, a sharp and very disturbing uptick in state violence against unarmed citizens, people who are indeed trying to exert the right to make democratic public claims in the public sphere. And there's also a very alarming production of a statist ideology that calls on citizens to worship the state and to fear the state under the rubric of haybat al-dawla, or the prestige of the state. This is nothing but a state-produced ideology to get citizens to fear the state rather than make demands on the state to reform itself and to improve citizens' lives. So I don't share his optimism, and I don't think that many political scientists or ordinary citizens would share it either.
Yeah. What about the argument that you sometimes hear that there's parallels here, perhaps, with Portugal in 1973. There are these moments when you've had a crackdown on democratic expression, and military comes into power, and looking back now, we can see that that perhaps did lead to an opening in terms of democracy. Is there any parallel that you can sort of find between, let's say, Portugal in 73 and other sort of cases in the third wave of democracy and in Egypt today?
Yeah, Portugal is invoked because Portugal is actually an outlier. It was a military coup, but it was a democratic military coup, partly because the putschist officers were not high-ranking generals, they were actually colonels. And this was a coup against the military hierarchy, against Portugal's involvement in its colonies in Africa. It was an attempt to end imperialism. So in that sense, it was a very progressive military coup. But let's remember the historical record. The Portuguese military, it was called the Armed Forces Movement, eventually developed interests of its own, and it actually required civilian political forces to sign a document that exceeded military supremacy over the political process. After that first spring of April 1974, that was called the Carnation Revolution. It was called the Carnation Revolution because citizens were putting carnations in the barrels of guns, and it represented the unwillingness of the Portuguese military to fire on its own citizens. If we fast forward to the Egyptian case, we have an entirely different type of military coup. First of all, this is a military coup that's conducted by the military hierarchy, indeed the generals. This is not an insurgent group of colonels who are trying to overthrow the hierarchy. This is the hierarchy, and the hierarchy here is overthrowing a duly elected, if very fragile, democratic government. So in that sense, there is no comparison on the level of military or politicization of the military. And then if you want to go further, if you just want to broaden the lens beyond what kind of a military this is, the Egyptian military hierarchy that has just conducted the coup, unlike the Portuguese military, is not interested in the opening up of a previously authoritarian system, as was the Portuguese state, but they are interested in re-inscribing, again, citizen fear of the state, and re-inscribing the notion that not everybody has a chance to get inside politics. The Egyptian revolution was a breakthrough because at its fundamental level, like all great revolutions, it betokened the beginning of a new era when ordinary people make claims on those who hold power. That is existentially a threat to high-ranking military generals, and this is their moment to put the political participation genie back in the bottle. I think that the more cogent comparison is not to the Portuguese transition of 1974, but to military coups such as the Chilean military coup of 1973, the Portuguese military coup of the Brazilian military coup of 1964, coups that are conducted by high-ranking generals to shut down incipient democratic experiments.
Let's shift focus a little bit to discuss an area that you've written upon, and that's the evolution of sort of political thought in the Muslim Brotherhood. There's been a lot of discussion now in terms of the Arab Spring, looking back, that Tunisia is the one success model that sort of seems to be working so far, and you have sort of similar sort of stories in many ways, that you have mainstream sort of electorally committed Muslim Brotherhood like parties that come to power. But in the case of Tunisia, they seem to have read the political landscape much better. They made serious coalitions, concessions, and they still have a chance. I mean, the transition is still on track. Well, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's a very different story. And we also know that there was a lot of communication back and forth between Ennahda and the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to advise them, look, don't make these mistakes, you're setting yourself up for a trap. So how would you sort of just explain in broad terms why Ennahda seemed to have a better sort of track record of success in contrast with Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah. Let's look at two factors. One is an external factor that has to do with the Egyptian political environment relative to the Tunisian, and then the other factor is internal. If we just look at the external factor, first of all, the Egyptian political arena is distinguished from the Tunisian political arena by one major elephant in the room, and that is a highly politicized military establishment. A military establishment that sees itself not just as the core of the state, but as above the state and above society. This military establishment doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a major U.S. ally. It's a major client of the U.S. government and has been since 1979 to the tune of $1.3 billion in military assistance every year. So this is not only every military in every country already has a leg up over civilian forces by its control of coercive power, but beyond that, the Egyptian military also has the support of a major world power. That is fundamentally different from the smaller, much less politicized Tunisian military. So on that front, the Egyptian Muslim Brothers face a much more implacable adversary in the Egyptian military than the Tunisian Islamists. So that's the environment part. If we look inside the two movements themselves, there are really important differences in the two movements. Even though in the large scheme of things, they're both mainstream Islamists, they're also both what I call parliamentary Islamists. That is, they accept, and in fact they embrace, elections as the means to gain power. They are not putschists. In fact, they are committed Democrats with a small d, even if they see democracy as an instrumental purpose to get into power, but they still abide by democratic rules. Both of them are in that large family of Islamists, unlike extremist Islamists who abjure the democratic experiment entirely and think that it's illegitimate. However, beyond that large similarity, I think there's clear differences in their evolution. The Tunisian Islamists have actually been forced to and/or made much more far-reaching ideological revisions, and those revisions have been very open and public. Partly it has to do with the rather specific figure of Rashid al-Ghannouchi himself, who is an intellectual. The Muslim Brothers lack that kind of intellectual theorist, the person who can step back and diagnose the political epoch and then chart a course forward. They have never really been very patient with that kind of theorizing. They've always been, from their very moment, they are actors.
Why is that, though, the comparative distance? Because they're both repressed by the states, they were both come out of similar sort of religious milieu, and there's a lot of Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals who are part of the movement. So why, has it been possible in the case of Tunisia sort of develop those type of intellectual sort of flexibility and sort of rethinking of sort of positions with respect to democracy and political development, while you don't have that similar development in the
Yeah, that's a
Egyptian
really
case?
good question. I'm not sure I have an answer off the top of my head, but I can generate some reflections or observations about their differences. The Muslim Brothers, again, from their inception, have been much more doers. They're impatient with that kind of internal wrangling.
Right.
However, because they've been subjected to very serious state repression for a much longer time span than Al-Nahda, they're just older. They've been around older than the current Egyptian regime. They've been around since 1928. So they've actually developed a much more secretive, hierarchical decision-making process. They do have a decision-making process, and they actually do have internal elections. But those kinds of procedures are wholly untransparent to the outside observer for reasons of survival. They had to keep these things under wraps, not just because of reasons of internal cohesion, but every time they actually tried to meet, the state would actually come and arrest all of them. So they didn't have the, for lack of a better term, the space or sort of the experience of exile that Rashid al-Ghannouchi had to rethink his positions and to look from the outside at his own experience. The Muslim Brothers never had that. They've always been embroiled in the nitty-gritty of Egyptian politics. And though, as you pointed out, they actually have very important intellectuals or sympathetic thinkers, let's say, those sympathetic thinkers have always been on the sidelines. They're heard from, but they have no actual spiritual and or decision-making power within the deciders of the organization. Those are pure organization men.
You mentioned the experience in exile, and we often hear that it was Rashid Ghannouchi's 20 years in London that was perhaps, you know, a key sort of difference here, because he was in London. Some people say he was forced to rethink his ideas, but also there's this idea that he was exposed to British parliamentary democracy, and that forced him to sort of think more critically about the relationship between religion and politics, religion and state, questions of secularism, etc. How much emphasis would you put on that as being a key factor in explaining the, you know, intellectual and political flexibility of Ennahda versus the Brotherhood?
I think there's something to be said for that, but rather than location, I think the experience of exile itself. Even if Rashid al-Ghannouchi had been somewhere else, even in another Arab country, I think that just that experience in the history of political thought, even if you're in internal exile in a prison for that long of a period, and indeed the only time that the Muslim Brothers did have that experience, they actually produced a very important tract. In 1969, their former supreme guide, or their former leader, Ibrahim al-Hudaybi, produced a very important tract by the title of I don't recall it off the top of my head right now, but it was an important re-evaluation of their role in Egyptian politics, and it was an exhortatory text. It was basically addressed to the Muslim Brothers and to others to say, we are not a movement that's